My name, as Monica said, is Bairbre Nic Aongusa, and I am, as Assistant Secretary in the new department, Head of the Community Development Division. And our department is now the main policy department for your sector, for the charity and voluntary and community sector. So what I want to do very briefly today is to give you a brief introduction to our new department and to give you an overview of where we stand, our strategic objectives, our role, and so on. And then finally to wrap up maybe with some impressions and responses to what I heard at your various sessions this morning. So the Department of Rural and Community Development, we're a very young department. We're not even 1 year old yet. Minister Michael Ring was appointed as Minister for Rural and Community Development in June 2017, and legislation was passed in the Dáil in July of last year to establish us. We also have a Minister of State, Sean Kine, who has particular responsibility for the community and voluntary sector. We have 3 divisions: Rural Development, which is headed by my colleague William Parnell, Community Development, which is myself, and Corporate and Finance. And we have a new Assistant Secretary, Sheena Rooney, who has recently joined us to head up that division. We are the smallest of the government departments. It's no longer the Department of Children that's the smallest department now, it's us. We have about 170 staff, which includes the staff of the Charities Regulator, which is one of the agencies under the department. Our other agencies being Irish Water Safety and the Western Development Commission and PUBL. And we have offices not only in Dublin, our headquarters are in Dublin, where the Minister and the Secretary-General are based, but we also have offices in Ballina, where almost 2/3 of our staff are located in Ballina. So when it comes to determining what the challenges are for rural Ireland, we actually have in our own staff a very useful knowledge base. And I'm delighted that we have some colleagues from the department here today as well. So far I have met Dara from Dublin and Annette from Ballina, but there may be others there. So they're here and they're among you and they're listening, and we're all learning about the sector. So by law, each department has to adopt a statement of strategy within 6 months of a new minister being appointed. So development of our statement of strategy for 2017 to 2020 was an opportunity for us as a new department to, I suppose, set out our stall and set out a strategic vision as to what we would like to achieve. And as you can imagine, this required quite a lot of thinking on our part as a department because we were so new. And other than a vague concept that we were to look after rural Ireland and community affairs, we had to kind of work out, well, what is our role? And the core thing for us was, how can we as a department add value to what's already out there? There are big heavy hitters already active in this space in government: the HSE, the Department of Social Protection, on the rural side, Department of Agriculture, Department of Transport. We need to look at how we as a department can be, if you like, a catalyst to help make a difference, even though we may not have those kind of resources. So our new role, where we have been thinking, is to develop a new role across government, making the linkages between all of the various sectors that impact on communities and impact on rural communities in particular, and to try and forge better networks and better linkages and better relationships. And in particular, as a new department, there's an opportunity for us to foster new relationships with the stakeholders in our space. Fostering new relationships, but also strengthening existing ones, and to be frank, maybe rebuilding relationships that may have been damaged or downgraded in the past. And that is something that, certainly from what I heard this morning, there is an appetite for. And finally, we have a role to ensure that there's good governance across all of our areas, as every government department does. But also, in particular, because we have the Charities Regulator under our aegis, we have a particular interest in ensuring that we have good governance across the sector, but that it is also not to the extent that it might undermine the core purpose of the sector and the good work that the sector does. So I noticed that it was remarked this morning that it was welcome that the charities regulator was under the same department that has responsibility for community development and community and voluntary sector. And I think that's fitting, because the regulator is statutorily independent in the exercise of his functions, and that's an absolute. But for the funding department to have an understanding of what the requirements are of the regulator, and also to be mindful of the fact, and in fairness, I think the regulator is also very mindful of this, of the need for the regulation to be proportionate to the requirements, and also not to undermine the core purpose and the core function of a charity or an organisation. So moving on, I'm talking now about our statement of strategy, which is published on the department's website. And this is our mission. And as you can see, promote rural and community development and support vibrant, inclusive and sustainable communities throughout Ireland. So our work in relation to communities in particular is not just rural Ireland. In fact, an awful lot of our community work is in urban areas and areas of urban disadvantage. As Ireland starts to recover, I think our department can play a key role in ensuring that as our economy improves and people's living standards improve, that those at a disadvantage are not left behind. And it often seems to me that this talk of an urban-rural divide in Ireland is a bit of a misnomer, because it seems to me that the real divide in our society going forward is going to be between advantage and disadvantage. Those who are disadvantaged, whether it's by reasons of poverty or geographical isolation, or being part of an immigrant community or the traveller community or so on, all of these parts of our society are in danger of being forgotten and left behind if we are not focusing on the whole of our community in terms of its development. So our vision is that all communities will have the opportunity to develop economically and socially. We are absolutely convinced that economic and social development are interlinked and have to be dealt with together. As I said, focusing purely on economic development and jobs delivery without paying attention to the social factors that help people to actually improve their quality of life leaves too many people behind. And the other piece is the focus on development. Originally, when our department was mooted, it was going to be the Department of Community and Rural Affairs. And we made a proposal to government that the word development would be substituted, very, very specifically because we want our department to have a strategic developmental role, and not just a department where any concerns about these groups that might be considered not a priority for others would get sent to a kind of a post box for grants, as somebody once described it to me. So I think the civil society role that has been talked about this morning is very, very much relevant to our vision and our mission, as you can see. So our statement of strategy sets out 4 strategic goals for the department. 2 in relation to rural development, and as you can see there, I've kind of highlighted in a highlighter pen. Originally, the faint lines were supposed to be in yellow and the rest were supposed to be in black, but anyway, as you can see, working across government, as I said earlier, is our key function in the rural development side. And also to ensure that regional development, that all of the regions in the country can contribute to economic recovery. And crucial to that is the National Planning Framework and the National Development Plan, or Project Ireland 2040, you may have heard of it. And Minister Ring and our department has been given responsibility for a €1 billion regional rural regeneration and development fund under Project Ireland 2040 to ensure that regional development and rural communities benefit from the national planning framework and the future development of our country. So moving then to the strategic goals in my own area in community development, And remember, community development is both urban and rural communities in disadvantaged areas. Our policy focus is very clearly on empowering local communities, based on community development principles to help them to identify their own needs and aspirations, and providing them with skills and confidence and opportunities to influence and shape and participate in decision-making processes. And as you may know, we were in the Department of Environment before, and we had links with local community development committees and our links with local government. We've got public participation networks, which enable people to influence and participate in decision making. And the second goal is very pertinent, I think, to today's discussion, which is about strengthening the capacity of the community and charity and voluntary sector to enable you to contribute to civil society and to play your part in helping us to build those inclusive, sustainable communities. And finally, to mention volunteering isn't up there, but volunteering is definitely a key part of that sector too. And philanthropy is an area which needs to grow and develop in Ireland too, because it also is an ingredient for a vibrant and sustainable society and community. So I think I'm well over time, but this is my last slide, which when I was drafting yesterday, of course, I had no idea what I was going to say. But just after that whistle-stop tour, maybe just a few thoughts about what I heard today and what it might mean for the department going forward. First of all, what I heard, which was encouraging, I suppose, was that Irish civil society is in rude good health, according to one of the speakers I was at a session at. First of all, to say I would have liked to have been in 3 places at once, but it wasn't possible, so I only went to one session after lunch. But earlier, actually, at our first session, we heard some really encouraging stories. Mary Moynihan, I think, spoke about telling our stories, and I gather that the other sessions in the morning were all about inspiring stories of really good work that's being done. So that all of that stuff has been very, very encouraging. What was challenging, I think, were some references to the government smothering or choking the community and voluntary sector. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that there's another side to that story, which is, of course, that there's always going to be a tension between government funding charity and voluntary groups who are kind of also advocating and challenging government policy. So I think what we need to think about is how we manage those relationships. One of the key competencies in many of the management courses I've gone on, people talk about a competency for a manager or a leader is managing relationships. And it's where somebody described it as you're walking on a tightrope. You want to achieve an outcome, but you don't want to achieve the outcome at the expense of damaging the relationship that you have with the key stakeholder. So maybe we need to think about how we manage our relationships better. It takes 2 to tango. So just to give you another perspective, if government is to provide additional funding for compliance activity, for example, it would be good if charities and voluntary sector bodies acknowledged government's role in funding a lot of their activities. For example, I will just give you one example where during the recent storm Emma, a media commentator talked about the fact that the government was doing nothing for homeless people during the period of the snow. And if it wasn't for the great voluntary organisations, the homeless people would have been left out on the streets. Now, I know from my own experience, having been in the Department of Housing for 3 years, that the voluntary organisations are funded 95%, at least, maybe 80% anyway, by government money. So I'm not saying those voluntary organisations gave that impression, but the media have that impression, the public have that impression. And I think one of the concerns coming from government is that the Government of Ireland doesn't necessarily always get the credit for what the government puts into the services. Somebody spoke this morning about valuing the dissenting role of the charity and voluntary sector, and I absolutely agree with that. I think, though, we need to have a critical friend on both sides. And we need to work on that relationship about how, you know, with a good friend, they can tell you something and then you can take it, and then similarly you can also criticise. So we need to work, I think, and to build on what the good relationships we already have on that basis. So what needs to happen now? It seems to me that there's words that I've heard this morning about collaboration, partnership, dialogue, trust. I would add mutual respect. Many of these things are really important, and they're the areas I think that we can work on and we can take forward. What I've also found that I didn't like was talk of government and kind of a them and us. And absolutely, we have different roles. Those of us who fund you from the public sector and then the charity and voluntary sector. But what unites us, I think, is what we need to focus on. And in the earlier section, we were asked, what is it that drives your organisation? And the words that struck me when I was thinking about what drives my organisation is core purpose, values, passion. And those words are also popping up from the contributions of organisations that are very, very different to the Department of Community and Rural and Community Development. So if we focus initially on core purpose and values, that's the strength of your sector. It's also the strength of the civil service, and the civil service can actually be an ally for your sector in terms of jointly achieving what we want to do. So let's build on the strength of our core commitment to building vibrant, inclusive and sustainable communities. And I have to say, I look forward very much to learning more about the sector, only here less than a year, and to building on it and doing great things in the future. Thanks very much.